So to get a better understanding of the interests that are involved in intelligence reform and why the expression of those interests might actually be detrimental to national security, let's look at two options for remedying the lack of intelligence cooperation as a result of 9/11. All right, so two ways to solve this problem. So as we've learned, one of the key problems was that the FBI and the CIA actually didn't coordinate their activities and that they didn't share important intelligence with each other. There was actually a third actor in this equation. So there was the FBI, the CIA, but also something called the DIA, or the Defense Intelligence Agency. So the problem was really about lack of coordination between these three main intelligence bodies. So there are two ways to deal with this problem. Okay, so option one is largely autonomous organizations. All right, so I'd like you to meet the leaders of these organizations. All right, so here's the FBI. All right, here's the CIA, and now we need to put the DIA into the equation. So we've got three largely autonomous organizations. They're separately organized, they don't work well together, and there's no mechanism for forcing them to work together. Right? They're all doing their own individual thing. All right. So they're doing their own individual thing. So the other option is a completely different structure, all right? So you take your three organizations and you force them to work together. Well, how do you do that, all right? You create an overall supervisory position over them called the Director of National Intelligence, all right? He's a mean guy. He's scary to these organizations, all right? And so the Director of National Intelligence actually has the power to force these guys, stop competing with each other. You must share your budgets and your priorities, all right? And because the director actually controls their budgets and their future and their missions, these guys cooperate and they behave, okay? So two different options for doing these things, all right? So let's look at the first option, which was the largely autonomous organizations. All right, there's some pros and cons to these options. So let's say you have largely autonomous organizations. They're all doing their same, different thing, not cooperating. They're just not close together at all. All right, so there's some cost to this. And one of them is obvious. These three guys, they're all doing the same thing with no coordination. So instead of one intelligence agency investigating, I don't know, me, you have three, and they're doing the exact same thing. That costs money. It's redundant. It may be unnecessary. But there are also some benefits to keeping these three guys separate. And one of them is the same thing. It's that they're all doing the same thing. So in the process of each of these organizations doing the same thing, they're competing with one another. All right? They're not close together. And this competition can actually be used by policymakers to make choices between them. All right? So if you have three competing intelligence organizations, the president actually gets three different sets of eyes looking at the same information, all right? Three different sets of brains analyzing it, three different choices and understandings about what it means. And these three different interpretations can actually help the president avoid some mistakes and some problems because you have more people looking at the same thing. They may come up with different interpretations. They may see problems that somebody else missed, right? So there's another thing that happens when these organizations compete with each other, all right? They're all competing with each other. So this wants the mission of the other two. So what does this guy do? He looks at the other agencies in fine detail, and he explains to policymakers, those other two rubber monster intelligence agencies, they're doing the following 10 bad things, all right? Now, these guys aren't going to tell you what they're doing bad, right? And certainly the people who are looking at what they're trying to do don't have the time or the expertise to discover those problems. So when this guy explains what these people are doing badly, they of course seek retaliation and explain what this guy is doing badly. So you get more information. Oversight becomes easier. There's more of an opportunity for civilian leaders to understand what's going on and then to see these mistakes and to come up with ways to correct them. The other consequence of this is innovation, okay? Each of the three finger monsters competing for the same mission, all trying to do something, the one that does it better wins the resource game. So they're constantly competing with each other to create new ways of doing the same tasks and to be better at it. And this is one of the key benefits of organizations that compete with each other. So it encourages innovation. Second key benefit is it actually gives policymakers a choice, all right? So let's go back to the option where all of our intelligence agencies are actually very closely coordinated. All right, this is option 2. Close coordination with somebody who oversees them and makes them behave. So what are the benefits? All right, this guy's scary, right? So these guys are cooperating, so they're cutting out the duplication. They're cutting out the waste. They're worried about these things. They're not all doing the same thing. They're forced to cooperate, and that saves us money, all right? But what are the costs, right? Since these bureaucracies are cooperating, they're all doing the same thing, and the decision is made over here, there's actually much less of an incentive to be innovative. There's less policy choice, right? The Director of National Intelligence may know all of the problems over here, but he's sure as hell not going to tell it to Congress or the President because that makes him look bad as well. So mistakes, problems, they stay within the agency, and that makes oversight more difficult. This kind of cooperation in upper management also leads to something that Sam Huntington called strategic monism. That is, one strategy as opposed to many. So when these bureaucracies are working together, they all start to develop a common way of doing something. There's no incentive for them to do something different because it's the director that's making choices between them, all right? So there's no incentive to do anything other than the same thing in many cases. So there's no innovation. There's no way of thinking differently about the world. They take new pieces of intelligence and they all start to view it in the same way, all right? So which of these options, competition or cooperation, seems the best for national security? All right? So to answer that question, the first trick is to realize you don't have enough information to determine the answer yet. The answer isn't clearly yes or no. The answer depends upon the strategic context in which you're trying to collect intelligence. All right? If threats are clear, and if they're unambiguous, and if we all agree on them, then competition is bad, all right? Competition is unnecessary because it's redundant. It's an unnecessary cost. We already know what threatens us. We agree about it. There's no need to compete. There's no need to generate that information because we're in general agreement. There's no need for innovation since we all see the problem the same way and we know what to do about it. So therefore, independent organizations, if you know what's going on, you don't need them. You can't afford the costs, right? But let's look at a different strategic environment. Let's say that you don't know what threatens you. You're uncertain about the future. We don't know what might hurt us, how they might hurt us, or when that might happen. So in determining that answer, you're better off having 3 competing bureaucracies looking at that information, asserting 3 different sets of notions of what could happen. Because then this still costs money, right? You still have duplication. You still have 3 agencies doing the same thing, but they might come up with different answers. And since you're really uncertain about what the world looks like, that difference can help you decide what you want to do. So if the strategic environment is uncertain, then competing intelligence agencies are actually the safest bet, not highly structured and organized intelligence agencies. But if the strategic environment is really clear, then the costs of competition are unnecessary. It's better off to go with the option where you have someone who's overseeing them all and making them cooperate. All right, but there's still another twist to this difference between competition versus cooperation. What if you're the president, right? Which option is best for you and for your bureaucratic interests? So having one director who forces the intelligence agencies to work together, that might be okay strategically, it might not, but for you as a bureaucracy, it's good because this one manager makes sure these 3 agencies are quiet and compliant and manageable, right? Not having a strong centralized leadership certainly means competition, but with that competition comes bickering and complaining, and each of those intelligence agencies is going to go off in the world and look for another ally to help them. It's messy, all right? So with competing agencies, the agencies will go to different members of Congress, and then those members of Congress will collude with the agency against the president. It's a bigger, multiplayer political game. It's harder for the president to control, and that matters. All right. So Thus, one of the things that you have to consider when you're talking about whether or not to pick cooperation or not cooperation is the vested interest of the president. Of course, Congress has a different bureaucratic interest, right? The president's closer to the intelligence agencies because they're part of the federal government. So for Congress to get information from them, they actually want them to compete because Congress doesn't oversee. They're not as close to the federal government as the president is. So they need those agencies to argue. Otherwise, they're deprived of information. And sometimes that information is important for national security, but it's always important for doing battle if you disagree with the president. So another concern when you're trying to decide between competition versus centralized control is whether or not you have divided government, because then bureaucratic interests are at stake. Right? There's also an additional calculation, all right? And this is the need to avoid blame. During times of strategic uncertainty, if the intelligence agencies are all offering different options, which one is correct? How do you know? The world's uncertain, and each of the three agencies is saying something different. So as president, you can pick, right? What if you're wrong? What if you're wrong and people die because you picked the wrong answer? You're responsible. American people are going to hate you. They're going to hate your party. They're going to hate you for re-election. They're going to hate your legacy. They're going to do all sorts of bad things, right? So presidents instead prefer to force the intelligence agencies to deal with this problem. They would prefer the intelligence agencies to have to make that choice. They don't want them to argue. They want them to make a choice. And so if there's ever a problem, the president can always say, I didn't know. It was those folks that did it. Right? Similarly, Congress has the same incentive. Right? Congress has an incentive, as we know from the Amy Zegart argument, to squawk and squawk and squawk about the need for reform, and then to not really take an active role in the process. So what we see from looking at new institutionalism and a whole bunch of little monsters, all right, is that bureaucratic design and the policy process reflect three different goals. One of them is absolutely to make good policy, but the second is to help the president and Congress pursue their interests to always be involved in the process, and the third is to help them avoid blame.